At the end of these harrowing weeks, after all these evenings when the town poured into the streets and wandered around them, Ryu realized that he no longer needed to protect himself against pity. When pity is useless, one grows tired of it. And the doctor found its only conclusion for the exhausting days in the feeling of hearty sorrow closing around itself. He knew that it would make his task easier. That is the why he welcomed it. When his mother, meeting him as he came in at 2 o'clock in the morning, was pained by the empty look he gave her, she was actually regretting the only comfort that Ryu could enjoy. To struggle against the abstraction, one must come to resemble it a little, but how could Rambert be persuaded of that? The abstraction of Rambert was everything that stood in the way of his happiness. In truth, Ryu knew that the certain sense of journalist was right, and that he also knew that sometimes abstraction may become stronger than happiness, and only then should one take into account. This is what was happened when Rambert, the doctor, would learn if it were the details that Rambert would later confide in him. In this way, at a different level, he could follow the sort of dreary struggle between the happiness of the individual and the abstraction of the plague. That was to make up for the life of our town in the longer periods of time. However, where some people saw abstraction, others saw truth. A cloud fell across the end of the first month. The disease became a marked aggressive in the epidemic in the impressioned sermon of the Father Panelu, the Jesuit priest, who was misinterested in the old Michel of the start of the illness. Father Panelu was previously distinguished himself from the frequent contributors to the Bulletin of the Geographical Society of Iran, with his authoritative recollections of the epigraphs, but he had reached the wilder audience than that of the mere spectatorist with a series of lectures he gave on the modern individualism. Here he had warmly deciphered the diagram from the Christianity, which rejected both modern libertism and the obscurantism of the previous centuries. In these lectures, he had not spared his listeners from the hard truth, hence his reputation. Then at the end of some months, the essential authorities of the town decided to wage war on the plague by their own means, by organizing weak collective prayers. This demonstration of public pity was so unending that Sunday the solemn Mass under the auspice of the Saint Roche sent was who a victim of plague. Father Panelu was asked to preach on such an occasion. For the preceding fortnight he had torn himself away from his work at St. Augustine in the African Church, which was warned him the special place in his order. The man was fiery and passionate temperament. He had resolutely accepted the mission with which he was entrusted. For a long time before the sermon, people in the town were talking about it, and it was a way of marked importance, date in history of that time. A week of prayer was observed by many. It is not ordinarily for the people of Iran, and especially priests. On Sunday morning, for example, the sea bathing officers ceased the competitions and church ongoings, nor in the case that they had seen the light of the sun conversation. But on one hand, the town was closed and the ports barred, and was no longer possible to bathe. And on the other hand, there was rather odd state of mind, where without having fully accepted in themselves the surprise of the evening, in which they had caught up, they did obviously believe in something had changed. However, many still hoped that the epidemic would end, and that they would and their families would be spared. As a result, they did not yet feel any serious obligation. For them, the plague was only an unpleasant visitor, which would leave one day as it had entered. They were scared, but not desperate, and a time had yet to come where the plague seemed to them like a shape of their lives, where they had forgotten the extents that they had led the day before. In short, they were neither here nor there. As for the religion, like several other problems, the plague had put them in particular states of mind, and far remote the indifference of the passion in which one might have been defined to the objectivity. For example, most of those who had followed the week of prayer could have subscribed to the observations that one of the faithful mind of Dr. Ryu. In the event, it can't do any harm. Even Teru, having remarked in his notebook that the Chinese in such cases go and play the tambourines in front of the genuine of the plague, noted that the quite impossible in reality to know whether the tambourine or more efficient though their preventative health measures. He added only that he decided to question one would need for the inform the extents of the genuine of the plague, and the ignorance of the matter neglected any opinion that one might have. In any case, the cathedral of the town had to be more or less full of conversation throughout the week. One of the first days of the inhabitants still remember outside the gardens and the palms and the pomegranate trees which extend in front of the porch, to listen to the wave of invocations and prayers that followed out onto the street. Bit by bit, encouraged by the example, some listeners made up their minds to go in and timely add their voices to the response of the congregation. On Sunday, considerable crowds poured into the nave, overflowing onto the porch and the top of the steps. Since the evening before, the sky had been overcast and rain downpouring. Those who remained outside opened umbrellas, and Father Panelu climbed the steps to the pulpit. As scent of incense and the damp clothing hovered in the air. It was a medium height and stocky, and he leant forward across the edge of the pulpit, his large hands collapsing on the wood. One could see nothing of him except the thick black shape of the sermon by 2 patches of his cheeks, flushed red behind the steel-rimming glasses. He was strong, impassionate voice, which carried a long way. So when he launched a single vehement and thundering attack on the listeners, "My brethren, a calumny have befallen you, and my brethren, you deserve it." A stir ran through the congregation as far as the west door. Logically, what followed did not seem to tie in with the resounding first sentence. Only after the remainder of the oration did people realize that by a clever rhetorical device, like a boxer delivering a blow, the priest had impatient the themes of the entire sermon in a single stroke. Indeed, apparently the sentence Panelu quoted, the passage of Exodus concerning the plague in Egypt, said, "My first time that this tribulation appeared in history, it was a stroke down the enemies of God. Pharaoh opposed the design of the Eternal, and the plague brought him to his knees. Since the beginning of history, the scourge of the God had brought us down and proud beneath his feet. Think of that as you fall to your knees." Outside, the rain was coming down more heavily than the last sentence, delivered the midst of the total silence, made still deeper by the lashing out of the rain the cathedral windows. Thunderous force of such power stopped at the moment of hesitation. A few members of the congregation slipped from their chairs onto the praise stools. Others felt that they should follow the example, with the result that from one to another, with no noise except for the creaking of some chairs, very soon the whole congregation was kneeling down. At this, Paolo drew himself up, took a deep breath, and continued in increasingly apathetic tone. If the plague affects you now, it means that a time has come to reflect. They have just no need for fear, and the unjust should be trembled. In the vast granary of the universe, the implacable fails of the thresh and the human corn, until the chaff is divided from grain, and will be the more chaff than the grain. And to call the chosen the misfortunate, I was not willed by God. For too long the words of compassion compromised with evil. For too long it is reviled in divine mercy, because one only to repent everything that is permitted, and were represented the concern which meant man felt was strong. When the time came, one must surely repent. Unlike that, the easiest course was to let oneself go. The divine mercy would do the rest. Well, it could not last. God, who has no longer bent on the face of pity towards the town, is tired of waiting. Disappointed in his eternal hope, he has turned away his face. And we deprive of the light of God, with the language for a long time in the darkness of the plague. Some of the hall snorted like an impatient horse. After a short pause, the priest carried on, lowering his voice. One may read in the golden legend that the time the king Hamid, the Lowbury Italy, the ravaged by plague so violent that they were hardly enough living to bury the dead, and that this plague raged above all in Rome and the Pibia. And the good angel appeared for all to see, giving orders, and the bad angel who carried the haunting spear, commanding him to strike the horses, and for as many blows the horses received, there were so many dead that came out of it. Here Panlu extended two short arms towards the west door, as though pointing to something moving behind the curtain. "My brethren," he said empathetically.